The fog clung to the moors like a shroud, thick and unyielding, as Eliza Blackthorn trudged home from the village. It was 1837, and the year had been unkind, crops withered under relentless rain, whispers of famine echoing in every thatched roof. Her boots sank into the mud with each step, the hem of her woolen skirt heavy with damp. At 32, Eliza carried herself with the quiet resolve of someone who had buried too much, first her parents to the fever, then her husband, Thomas, to the earth 6 months past. His grave lay in the churchyard, marked by a simple stone she could ill afford. She paused at the garden gate, her basket swinging from one arm, laden with a meager sack of flour and a twist of salt. The cottage loomed ahead, its chimney belching thin smoke into the gray sky. Something stirred in her chest, a flutter of unease, or perhaps just the chill seeping through her shawl. Thomas had built this place with his own hands, plank by plank, before the mine collapse stole him away. Now it stood silent, save for the wind rattling the shutters. Inside, the fire crackled low in the hearth, casting flickering shadows across the flagstone floor. Eliza set the basket down and knelt to stir the embers, her fingers numb from the cold. The room smelled of peat and herbs, the air still heavy with the scent of last night's stew. She glanced at the corner where Thomas's chair sat empty, its leather cracked from years of use. A pang twisted in her gut, sharp as a thorn. He had been a sturdy man, broad-shouldered and kind-eyed, with a laugh that filled the rafters. Feeding him had been her joy, roasts from the neighbor's hog, pies bursting with blackberries from the hedgerows. Even in lean times, she made do. A soft thump came from the pantry, like a sack shifting on the shelf. Eliza froze, her spoon midway to the pot. Rats, she thought, though the traps had been empty for weeks. She rose slowly, wiping her hands on her apron, and pushed open the door. The small room was dim, lit only by the hearth's glow spilling in. Shelves lined the walls, holding jars of preserves and dried roots. Nothing seemed amiss at first, but as her eyes adjusted, she saw it, a faint trail of earth, dark and fresh, leading from the back wall to the floor. Her breath caught. The soil was the same rich black from the churchyard, carried on the wind or, no, that was foolish. She stepped closer, heart quickening. The trail ended at a loose floorboard, one she had pried up months ago to hide a few coins. Now it lay askew, as if nudged by an unseen hand. Kneeling, she lifted it fully. Beneath, the small tin box was untouched, but something else gleamed in the dirt, a sliver of bone, no longer than her thumb, etched with tiny teeth marks. Eliza recoiled, the bone clattering to the floor. It couldn't be. Thomas was buried proper, with prayers and earth piled high. Yet the fragment looked fresh, almost moist, as if unearthed that very morning. She snatched it up, her mind racing. Had she imagined the thump? No, the stew pot in the kitchen bubbled over now, forgotten, hissing steam into the air. That night, sleep evaded her. Eliza lay in the narrow bed, the quilt pulled tight against the drafts. The cottage creaked like it always did, but tonight the sounds felt deliberate, a scrape along the walls, a whisper of movement in the dark. By dawn, hunger gnawed at her own belly, but she pushed it aside. She had to check the grave. Slipping into her cloak, she left before the sun crested the hills, the bone tucked into her pocket like a guilty secret. The churchyard was a misty hollow, graves clustered like forgotten stones. Thomas's plot was at the edge, near the yew tree whose branches clawed the sky. Eliza knelt, her knees soaking through her skirts, and brushed away the wet leaves. The mound was intact, sodden but undisturbed. No fresh digs, no paw prints from foxes. Relief washed over her, mingled with shame for her fears. It was just a chicken bone, she told herself, dropped by some scavenger bird. But as she turned to leave, a low groan rose from the soil, not wind, not imagination. It bubbled up from beneath the earth, faint and guttural, like a man surfacing from deep water. Eliza stumbled back, her hand flying to her mouth. The sound faded as quickly as it came, leaving only the drip of rain from the yews. She ran then, all the way home, the fog swallowing her footsteps. Back in the cottage, she bolted the door and sank into Thomas's chair. The bone lay on the table now, accusing. What if it wasn't a chicken's? What if the mine hadn't killed him clean, and some part of him lingered, hungry even in death? The thought was madness, born of grief and empty larders. Yet as she stared at the fragment, a strange compulsion stirred. She rose, fetched a scrap of bread from the basket, and placed it beside the bone. "For you," she whispered, voice trembling. "If it's you calling." The fire popped, and for a moment, the shadows seemed to lean in, watching. The fog clung to the Blackthorn cottage like a shroud, muting the creak of the warped floorboards as Eliza stepped inside. Her hands, still raw from the grave digging, trembled as she set the lantern on the scarred oak table. The flame flickered, casting long shadows that danced across the walls, where faded tapestries depicted harvest feasts long forgotten. She had buried Thomas at dawn, under the ancient yew tree in the churchyard, his face pale and still as the earth swallowed him whole. But the weight in her chest hadn't lifted. If anything, it pressed harder, a hunger that wasn't her own. She sank into the chair by the hearth, the one Thomas had carved for her on their wedding night. The fire was low, embers glowing like half-closed eyes. Eliza's fingers traced the armrest's whorls, memories surfacing unbidden, his calloused hands shaping the wood, his laughter filling the room as he tested its sturdiness. "For you, my love," he'd said, "to hold you steady through the storms." Now the storms were inside her, brewing in the silence. She hadn't eaten since yesterday, but food held no appeal. Instead, she thought of the stew she'd left simmering before the call came from the fields, Thomas collapsing amid the barley, his body seizing from the fever that had ravaged the village for weeks. A soft thump echoed from the pantry, sharp against the quiet. Eliza froze, her breath catching. Rats, she told herself, the pests that had plagued them all summer. But the sound came again, deliberate, like a fist rapping on wood from within. She rose slowly, skirts brushing the rushes on the floor, and approached the door. The latch was cold under her palm. Inside, shelves sagged under jars of preserves and sacks of flour, the air thick with the scent of dried herbs and earth. Nothing stirred. She exhaled, chiding her nerves, and reached for the basket of potatoes on the lowest shelf. As she turned to leave, a whisper slithered through the crack beneath the door, or was it from the walls themselves? "Eliza." Faint, like wind through dry leaves, but unmistakable. Her name, in Thomas's voice. She dropped the basket, tubers rolling across the floor like spilled secrets. Heart pounding, she flung the pantry door wide, peering into the shadows. Empty. Just the usual clutter, the faint outline of the root cellar stairs descending into darkness. She slammed the door shut, leaning against it, her pulse a drum in her ears. Grief, that's all it was. The mind played cruel tricks after loss. But as she gathered the potatoes, her gaze snagged on the small, locked box in the corner, the one Thomas had kept for his remedies, herbs and tonics he'd brewed from the woods. It was ajar now, though she swore she'd latched it that morning. Inside, a single vial lay tilted, its contents a murky red, like blood thinned with water. She hadn't seen him mix that one. A chill prickled her skin. Thomas had always been secretive about his work, especially after the fever started, muttering about feeding the fire within to stave off the weakness. She dismissed it as his way of coping, but now. The knock at the front door jolted her upright. It was Mrs. Harrow from the neighboring farm, her face gaunt in the lantern light as Eliza opened it. "Heard about Thomas," the woman said, voice low, eyes darting past Eliza into the cottage. "The whole village is whispering. Fever took him quick, but some say he wasn't right in the end. Talking to shadows, they claim." Mrs. Harrow clutched a bundle of bread wrapped in cloth, her offering meager but kind. "You alone now? Need anything?" Eliza forced a smile, taking the bread. "Just time, Mary. Time to mourn." But as she spoke, the whisper returned, closer this time, from the floorboards underfoot. Hungry. Mrs. Harrow's brow furrowed, as if she'd heard it too, but she shook her head and hurried back into the fog. Eliza bolted the door, her hands shaking as she unwrapped the bread. It smelled fresh, yeasty, but when she tore off a piece, it crumbled dry in her fingers. Useless. She needed something more substantial, something to quiet the gnawing that wasn't in her stomach at all. By midnight, the cottage felt smaller, the walls pressing in with the weight of unspoken words. Eliza lit another candle and sat by the window, staring into the mist-shrouded yard. The yew tree in the distance was a silhouette, its branches like skeletal fingers. She remembered Thomas's last words, gasped as she held him, "Don't let me go hungry, Eliza. Promise." She'd thought it delirium, the fever's cruel jest. But now, in the flickering light, she wondered. The shovel still leaned against the porch, dirt caked on its blade. Just to check, she told herself. Just to be sure he's at peace. She slipped on her cloak, the wool heavy with damp, and stepped out into the night. The path to the churchyard wound through brambles that snagged at her hem, drawing faint lines of blood. The air grew colder with each step, carrying the scent of turned earth and decay. At the grave, the mound was undisturbed, a simple stone marking, "Thomas Blackthorn, beloved husband, 1837. She knelt, pressing her palm to the soil. It was warm, unnaturally so, pulsing faintly like a heartbeat beneath. "Eliza." The voice was clearer now, not a whisper but a rumble from the ground. She recoiled, mud staining her hands. Panic clawed at her throat, but she dug her fingers in anyway, scooping away the loose dirt. Deeper, until her nails scraped wood. The coffin lid, hastily nailed, creaked under the pressure. She hesitated, breath ragged, then pried at the edge with a stick. A sliver of darkness yawned open, and from it wafted a smell, not rot, but something savory, like roasting meat left too long on the fire. Inside, Thomas lay as the fog clung to the Blackthorn farm like a shroud that morning, muting the crow of the rooster into a distant, muffled croak. Eliza Blackthorn stood at the kitchen window, her hands wrapped around a chipped porcelain cup, the tea inside long gone cold. She watched the mist swirl around the barn, where the cows lowed uneasily, their breaths puffing white in the chill. It had been 3 weeks since Thomas's burial, and the house felt emptier than ever, the silence broken only by the creak of settling timbers or the occasional thud from the root cellar below. She set the cup down with deliberate care, her fingers lingering on the handle as if it might slip away like everything else. The doctor from the village had stopped by yesterday, his face pinched with concern, muttering about grief and the importance of eating properly. "You must keep your strength up, Mrs. Blackthorn," he'd said, his eyes flicking to the untouched plate of bread and cheese on the table. She'd nodded, smiled faintly, and seen him out the door. Strength. As if that were the problem. Down in the cellar, the air was cooler, damper, carrying the earthy scent of potatoes and the faint, metallic tang that had appeared since the ground had been disturbed. Eliza descended the stairs slowly, her boots scraping against the stone steps. The lantern she carried cast jittery shadows on the walls, illuminating shelves lined with jars of preserves and sacks of flour. At the far end, behind a false panel of crates she'd shifted aside, lay the wooden box. It wasn't much, a simple pine coffin, hastily nailed shut after the funeral, too heavy for one woman to manage alone but light enough now, after she'd dragged it here under cover of night. She knelt before it, her skirts pooling around her like spilled ink. "Thomas," she whispered, her voice steady despite the tremor in her chest. The wood was rough under her palms, splinters catching at her skin. She'd pried open the lid that first night, driven by a compulsion she couldn't name, a hollow ache that whispered of unfinished business. His face had been pale, waxy, the burial shroud stiff around his shoulders. But his eyes, those dark, familiar eyes, had seemed to flicker in the lantern light, or perhaps it was just the flame dancing. From her apron pocket, she pulled a small cloth bundle, a heel of bread, softened with butter and a sliver of salt pork. Simple fare, the kind he'd favored on long days in the fields. She unwrapped it carefully, the steam from her breath mingling with the cellar's chill. "You always said a man needs his supper," she murmured, sliding the lid back just enough. The gap was narrow, but she worked the food through, her arm disappearing into the darkness. Something shifted inside, a soft rustle, like dry leaves stirring. Her heart quickened, but she didn't pull away. Instead, she pressed the bundle deeper, feeling the give of fabric and bone. Upstairs, the knock at the door came sharp and insistent, pulling her from the trance. She froze, listening. It was Widow Hargrove from the neighboring farm, her voice carrying through the wood. "Eliza." "It's Mary. I've brought some eggs and a bit of pie. You haven't been to market." Eliza wiped her hands on her apron, the faint greasy smear unnoticed, and climbed the stairs. By the time she reached the door, her face was composed, the cellar's secrets tucked away. Mary Hargrove bustled in, her basket swinging, cheeks flushed from the walk. She was a sturdy woman, 10 years Eliza's senior, with a no-nonsense braid and eyes that missed little. "You're looking peaky," she said, setting the basket on the table. "When's the last time you slept proper? And don't tell me you're still wearing that black bombazine, it's too severe for a young widow." Eliza forced a smile, busying herself with the kettle. "I'm managing, Mary. The work keeps me occupied." She poured fresh water, the steam rising like a veil between them. Mary's gaze wandered the room, the dust gathering on the mantel, the single chair pulled close to the hearth as if waiting for an absent occupant. "Sit with me a spell," Mary urged, patting the bench. "It's not right, you holding up like this. Thomas wouldn't want it." At the mention of his name, Eliza's hand paused on the stove. She sat, the wood creaking under her, and listened as Mary prattled on about village gossip, the miller's boy caught stealing, the parson's new sermon on Providence. But Eliza's mind drifted downward, to the box and the faint scratching that sometimes echoed in her dreams, like fingers tapping for more. When Mary left an hour later, promising to return with her mending circle, Eliza bolted the door and returned to the cellar. The bundle was gone, the shroud undisturbed, but the air felt heavier, charged with an unseen presence. She replaced the lid, her fingers tracing the nails she'd bent but not removed. "Soon," she said softly, though to whom, she couldn't say. Outside, the fog lifted slightly, revealing the mound in the backyard where the earth had been hastily filled in, a decoy grave, empty as a lie. The real hunger, she knew, lay deeper, and it was only beginning to stir. Elias hunched in a shadowed corner of the Blackthorn kitchen, his small frame swallowed by the oversized chair his father had once favored. The air hung thick with the scent of damp earth and boiled roots, a stew that Widow Blackthorn stirred with mechanical precision over the hearth. Outside, the wind clawed at the shutters, rattling them like impatient fingers. Elias's eyes, wide and unblinking, fixed on his mother's back, her shoulders rigid, her dark hair pinned in a severe knot that did nothing to hide the tremor in her hands. "Mother," he ventured, his voice a thin thread in the gloom. "The stew, it smells different tonight. Like the soil after rain." She didn't turn, only paused, the wooden spoon hovering above the pot. A bubble burst on the surface, releasing a faint, metallic tang that made Elias's stomach twist. "Eat when it's ready," she said, her tone flat as the graveled path to the churchyard. "No questions, Elias. Questions bring nothing but hunger." He shifted, the chair creaking under him, and glanced toward the door that led to the root cellar. It stood slightly ajar, as it had for days now, a sliver of blackness leaking into the room. Earlier that afternoon, he'd seen her descend those steps with a burlap sack slung over her shoulder, heavy enough to drag in the dirt. When she emerged, her skirts were muddied, and she hummed an old lullaby, the one she'd sung to him as a babe, but twisted now, the notes sour and off-key. The stew bubbled again, louder this time, and Widow Blackthorn ladled it into bowls with a clatter. She set one before him, the steam curling up like ghosts from the earth. Elias stared at the chunks floating in the broth, pale, fibrous things that didn't quite resemble the turnips from the garden. His spoon trembled in his grip as he lifted it, the first taste coating his tongue with something warm and forbidden. Down the lane, old Mrs. Harrow paused at her gate, her lantern swinging in the dusk. She'd heard the rumors from the miller's wife, whispers of the widow's late-night wanderings to the cemetery, of fresh dirt piled neat as a pie crust on Thomas Blackthorn's plot. Mrs. Harrow clutched her shawl tighter, the chill seeping not just from the fog rolling in from the moors, but from the unnatural quiet emanating from the Blackthorn cottage. No smoke rose straight from the chimney, it twisted, as if fleeing. She considered knocking, offering a neighborly pie or a prayer, but her feet rooted to the spot. Last week, the vicar had preached on gluttony, his eyes lingering too long on the widow's pew. Now, as a shadow flitted past the cottage window, tall, elongated, not quite human, Mrs. Harrow turned away, muttering a hasty blessing under her breath. Some hungers, she thought, were best left undisturbed. In the cellar, Widow Blackthorn knelt before the makeshift shelf, her fingers tracing the outline of the wrapped parcel she'd hidden there. The burlap was still damp, cool against her skin, and she pressed her palm to it, feeling the faint give beneath. "Soon, my love," she whispered to the darkness. "Another night, and you'll have your fill." The roots along the walls seemed to lean in, listening, their tendrils curling like veins in the flickering candlelight. Elias pushed his bowl away, the uneaten stew congealing. "I saw you, mother. By the grave. Digging." Her head snapped up from the pot, eyes gleaming like polished stones. For a moment, silence stretched, broken only by the drip of water from the eaves. Then she smiled, a thin curve that didn't reach her lips. "Curiosity killed the cat, boy. But satisfaction, that brings it back." He bolted from the chair, heart pounding, but the door to the upper house was already swinging shut behind her, the latch clicking with finality. Alone in the kitchen, Elias listened to the sounds from below, soft scrapes, like nails on wood, and a low, rumbling sigh that echoed up from the earth itself. Elias trudged through the mist-shrouded fields, the lantern in his hand casting a feeble glow that barely pierced the gloom. The air hung heavy with the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves, and each step sucked at his boots like the ground itself resented his passage. He'd left the Blackthorn cottage at first light, or what passed for it under the perpetual overcast sky, determined to reach the village before the storm broke fully. Widow Blackthorn's words echoed in his mind, her soft insistence that he fetch the priest, that something unnatural stirred in her home. But doubt gnawed at him, the woman was grieving, her mind frayed by loss, and now this talk of whispers from the grave. The path wound past the old oak that marked the boundary of her land, its branches twisted like arthritic fingers clawing at the heavens. Elias paused, wiping rain from his brow, and glanced back toward the cottage. Smoke still curled lazily from the chimney, a thin gray thread against the darkening sky. He shook his head, muttering to himself about foolish errands, and pressed on. The village was only a mile or so, but the mud made it feel endless, each squelch underfoot a reminder of how the land clung to secrets. By midday, the rain had turned relentless, drumming against his hat like impatient fingers. Elias spotted the first rooftops of Eldridge Hollow through the downpour, their thatched edges sagging under the weight of water. The tavern, the church, the mill, familiar shapes that promised warmth and dry clothes. He quickened his pace, the lantern now unnecessary in the gray light, its flame long extinguished by the wet. Father Harlan was in the churchyard when Elias arrived, kneeling by a fresh grave with a trowel in hand, tending to the modest markers that dotted the hill. The priest looked up, his face weathered and lined, eyes sharp beneath bushy brows. Water streamed down his cassock, but he didn't rise immediately, finishing his task with deliberate care. "Elias," Harlan said, straightening at last. His voice carried the gravel of years spent consoling the bereaved. "You look half drowned. What's brought you out in this?" Elias removed his hat, squeezing water from the brim. "It's the widow, Father. Mary Blackthorn. She's not well. Keeps saying things about her husband, Thomas. That he's calling to her from the ground." Harlan's expression tightened, though he masked it quickly with a nod. He gestured toward the church door. Come inside. We'll speak properly. The interior was dim, lit only by flickering candles on the altar. The air smelled of incense and old wood, a stark contrast to the storm outside. Harlan poured 2 mugs of weak tea from a kettle by the hearth, handing one to Elias before settling into a pew. Thomas Blackthorn was a good man. Died too young, fever took him quick. Buried proper, last month. What's she claiming, exactly? Elias sipped the tea, its warmth seeping into his chilled bones. He hesitated, the words feeling absurd in the sacred quiet. She says she feeds him still. Every night, leaves food by the bed where he slept. And now, she swears she hears him, hungry like, from the earth. Begged me to fetch you, says it's a sign from God or the devil, she can't tell. Harlan stared into his mug, the steam rising like ghosts between them. The rain battered the stained glass windows, turning the light into fractured colors that danced across the stone floor. Grief plays cruel tricks, the priest murmured. I've seen it before, widows hearing voices, seeing shadows. But Mary, she's always been steady. Kept to herself, but faithful. Elias leaned forward, his voice dropping. There's more. The larder, it's emptying faster than it should. Bread, meat, even the stores she put up for winter. She claims it's for him, but how? I saw the platters myself, scraps left like offerings. The priest set his mug down with a soft clink, his fingers steepled. Outside, thunder rumbled, low and ominous, vibrating through the walls. Harlan rose, pacing slowly toward the altar, his shadow elongating in the candlelight. The burial was hasty, with the fever spreading. Ground was soft, though, dug deep enough. But if she's disturbing the sight. He trailed off, eyes distant, as if recalling some half-forgotten rite. Elias felt a chill unrelated to the damp. You think something's wrong with the grave? Harlan turned, his face pale in the dimness. I think we should see for ourselves. Fetch your horse from the stable, I'll ready mine. We'll go to her cottage at dusk. If there's unrest, it needs laying proper, prayers, perhaps salt and iron if it comes to that. As they stepped back into the storm, Elias glanced at the churchyard, the grave's anonymous mounds under the relentless rain. One in particular caught his eye, slightly askew, the earth atop it darker, as if freshly turned. He blinked, and the illusion passed, but the unease lingered, coiling in his gut like the first stirrings of dread. The path back would be darker now, the mist thicker, and with it, the sense that eyes watched from the sodden fields, unseen, unblinking, waiting for nightfall. Elias hunched over the scarred oak table in the dim kitchen, the lantern's flame flickering like a hesitant heartbeat against the walls. The air hung heavy with the scent of damp earth and something sharper, metallic, that clung to Widow Blackthorn's skirts as she moved about the hearth. It was the 3rd night since the storm had unearthed the old grave behind the barn, and Elias, the hired hand who'd stayed on after her husband's passing, felt the weight of unspoken questions pressing on his chest. He poked at the stew in his bowl, the chunks of meat bobbing pale and uninviting in the broth. Can't say I've got much appetite tonight, ma'am, Elias muttered, pushing the bowl away. His voice carried the rough edge of the fields, but there was a tremor beneath it now, one he couldn't quite bury like the turnips in spring. Widow Blackthorn turned from the fire, her face shadowed under the loose cap of graying hair, eyes like polished stones in the low light. She was a tall woman, angular as the willows by the creek, and her hands, calloused from years of churning butter and mending fences, gripped the ladle a fraction too tightly. Waste not, want not, Elias. Thomas always said that. Food scarce enough without turning your nose up. Her tone was even, almost gentle, but it sliced through the quiet room like a scythe through ripe wheat. He glanced at the window, where the rain had finally eased to a patter, leaving the glass streaked and blurring the moonlit yard. The grave, Thomas Blackthorn's grave, had been little more than a shallow dip before the floodwaters clawed it open. Elias had helped rebury what they found, mud-slick bones and tatters of cloth, but the image lingered, the way the earth had seemed reluctant to release him, roots twisting like fingers around the ribs. And now, this stew. The meat didn't taste right, too tender for venison, too familiar. She ladled another portion into his bowl, the steam rising in lazy curls. Eat. It's good for you. Keeps the cold out. Her lips curved in what might have been a smile, but it didn't reach her eyes. Elias remembered the stories from the village, whispered over ale at the tavern, how Thomas had wasted away in his final months, his body failing while his hunger never did, always calling for more, until the end. The widow had nursed him alone, no midwife or priest, and when he was gone, she'd planted that rosebush over his plot, its thorns sharp as accusations. The spoon trembled in Elias's hand as he lifted a piece to his mouth. The flavor bloomed, savory, with a hint of salt from the earth itself. He chewed slowly, the texture yielding under his teeth, and swallowed against the bile rising in his throat. Outside, a branch scraped the windowpane, and he swore he heard a low groan from the direction of the barn, like wind through hollow bones. Widow Blackthorn sat across from him, her own bowl untouched, watching with that unblinking gaze. "Thomas wouldn't want you going hungry," she said softly, as if confiding a secret. "He always provided, even after, well, you know how it is with the land. It gives back what you put in." Her fingers drummed lightly on the table, nails bitten short, and Elias wondered if it was his imagination or if the lantern flame dipped lower, casting her shadow longer, reaching toward him like an outstretched arm. He set the spoon down, the clink echoing too loudly. "Ma'am, about the grave. I fixed the marker today, but the soil's still loose. Might need to dig deeper, make sure it's settled." His words tumbled out, a clumsy bid to shift the air between them, but her expression didn't change. "Deeper," she echoed, nodding slowly. "Yes, that's wise. Some things don't stay put if you don't push them down hard enough." She rose then, clearing the bowls with deliberate care, her skirts brushing the floorboards that creaked under her weight. Elias stayed seated, the stew sitting heavy in his gut, a warmth spreading that felt more like fever than sustenance. As she washed the dishes in the basin, the water sloshing rhythmically, Elias stared at the empty chair beside her, Thomas's chair, where a coat still hung on the back, moth-eaten but undisturbed. He could almost see the man there, gaunt and insistent, fork in hand, demanding another helping. The thought made Elias's skin prickle, and he rubbed his arms, chasing away the chill that no fire could touch. That night, as he lay on his pallet in the loft, the house settled around him with sighs and shifts. Sleep came fitfully, broken by dreams of soil filling his mouth, rich and unending. Downstairs, he imagined the widow at her table, alone with her ladle, stirring something that bubbled softly in the pot. And in the barn, the grave waited, its edges softening under the moon, as if the earth hungered too. The fog clung to the gravestones like a shroud, muting the distant toll of the church bell as Eliza Blackthorn knelt by the fresh mound of earth. Her fingers, raw from the night's digging, traced the wooden marker she'd carved herself, Thomas Blackthorn, beloved husband, 1795 to 1837. The air smelled of damp soil and decay, a scent that no longer turned her stomach. It was familiar now, like the scent of bread baking in the oven. She'd come alone this time, leaving the house shuttered against the prying eyes of the village. The whispers had grown louder since the miller's wife spotted her in the churchyard at dusk, carrying that covered basket. Feeding the dead, they'd murmured, half in jest, half in fear. But Eliza knew better. Thomas wasn't gone. Not truly. Every night, she brought him what he needed, scraps from her table, warm milk, bits of salted pork, to keep him from fading entirely. It was her duty, her love made manifest in the cold ground. The basket sat beside her, its cloth lid damp with mist. She lifted it carefully, peering inside. The loaf she baked that morning, studded with rosemary from the garden, lay unbroken. But something felt off. The ground here, at the head of the grave, was looser than it should be after 3 weeks. Her heart quickened as she pressed her palm against the soil. It gave way too easily, like flesh yielding under touch. A rustle in the underbrush snapped her head around. Elias Crow, the village apothecary, emerged from the shadows, his lantern swinging low. He was a wiry man in his 40s, with sharp eyes that missed nothing and a tongue sharper still. "Mrs. Blackthorn," he said, his voice steady but laced with that cautious edge she'd come to recognize. "Out for a midnight stroll again?" She rose slowly, shielding the basket behind her skirts. Elias had been kind after Thomas's passing, bringing tonics for her grief, checking on her larder. But lately, his visits carried questions, probing glances at the untouched plates she left on the table. "Just tending to the grave, Mr. Crow," she replied, forcing a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "A widow's work never ends." He stepped closer, the lantern light carving hollows in his cheeks. "Tending, aye. Or feeding. The boys at the inn been talking, saw you slip something under the earth last full moon. Folks are saying it's not right, Eliza. Unnatural." Her pulse thrummed in her ears. The boy, young Jamie, the stable hand, must have followed her one night. She clutched the basket tighter, feeling the loaf shift inside. "Superstition," she said, her voice firmer than she felt. "Thomas was a good man. I honor him as best I can." Elias's gaze dropped to the disturbed soil. He knelt without asking, brushing away the loose dirt with his free hand. Eliza's breath caught as he uncovered the edge of something pale, a bone. No, a root, twisted and pale from the frost. But deeper, the earth seemed to breathe, a faint tremor rippling outward. "See," he murmured, not looking up. "Nothing but weeds. But if there's more to it." He trailed off, his fingers hovering. Then, abruptly, he dug in, scooping handfuls aside. The lantern bobbed, casting erratic shadows that danced like specters. "Stop." Eliza lunged forward, grabbing his wrist. The basket tipped, spilling the loaf onto the grave. It landed with a soft thud, rolling toward the hole he'd begun. Elias yanked his arm free, staring at her with widened eyes, not fear, but a dawning realization. From the depths of the mound came a sound, a low, wet scrape, like nails on wood. The ground shuddered again, stronger this time, and Elias stumbled back, his lantern clattering to the stones. The light sputtered, then steadied, illuminating the impossible, a hand, gray and mottled, clawing up through the soil where the loaf had fallen. Eliza froze, her devotion cracking like thin ice. Thomas's fingers, she knew them, the calluses from the forge, the crooked joint on his ring finger. But they moved with a hunger that wasn't his, grasping blindly for the bread. Elias whispered a curse, scrambling to his feet. "God preserve us. What have you done?" She couldn't answer. The hand withdrew as suddenly as it appeared, pulling the loaf down into the dark with a greedy slurp. The grave settled, the soil knitting itself whole, leaving only a faint depression like a mouth after a meal. Elias backed away, his face ashen. "This ends now, Eliza. We tell the vicar. Or the constable. Whatever curse you've wrought, no." She whirled on him, her caution shattering into desperation. "You don't understand. He needs me. If I stop, he'll take more than bread next time." The apothecary hesitated, torn between flight and his healer's instinct. The fog thickened around them, swallowing the church bell's echo. In the distance, a dog's howl pierced the night, sharp and warning. Eliza snatched up the empty basket, her mind racing. Elias was right about one thing, the secret was unraveling. But she couldn't let them bury Thomas deeper, or worse, exhume him. Not when his appetite was only beginning to stir. She turned toward the path, her skirts whispering over the graves. "Go home, Mr. Crow. Pretend you saw nothing. For your sake." He didn't follow, but she felt his eyes on her back until the mist claimed her. The house waited, dark and silent, but tonight it felt less like a sanctuary and more like a trap closing in. Thomas would want his supper soon, and she'd have to find more to give, before the village came knocking with torches. The lantern's flame guttered low in the damp cellar air, casting jagged shadows that clawed at the stone walls like desperate fingers. Eliza Blackthorn knelt beside the iron pot, her skirts sodden from the seep of groundwater that never quite dried in this forsaken corner of the house. Her hands, calloused and steady despite the chill, stirred the contents with a wooden spoon worn smooth from years of the same grim task. The smell rose thick and savory, mingling with the earthy rot of the place, a scent that had once turned her stomach but now felt as familiar as her own breath. Upstairs, the floorboards creaked under the weight of Reverend Hale's cautious steps. He had insisted on coming alone this time, leaving his sister and the doctor behind in the parlor, their whispers trailing him like ghosts. Eliza heard the hesitation in his footfalls, the pause at the top of the stairs before he descended. She didn't look up when the door swung open, letting in a draft that made the lantern dance. "Mrs. Blackthorn," Hale said, his voice a low rumble, edged with the fatigue of too many sleepless nights. He carried no Bible this evening, only a small satchel slung over his shoulder, its leather creased from travel. "The storm has passed. The roads are passable now. You could leave this place tonight, if you wished." She kept stirring, the spoon scraping against the pot's bottom with a rhythmic scrape. "Leave? And go where, Reverend? The grave follows me, not the other way round." He stepped closer, his boots leaving muddy prints on the packed earth floor. The light caught the lines etched deep around his eyes, marks of a man who'd wrestled with doubts he could no longer pray away. In the week since they'd unearthed the truth, or what passed for it in Blackthorn Hollow, the Reverend had changed. No longer the stern voice from the pulpit, he moved like a man testing each step for hidden snares. "I've spoken to the constable in the next county. Discreetly. They know nothing of this. We could say you were widowed by fever, take you to a quiet parish. Start anew." Eliza paused, the spoon hovering. A chunk of meat bobbed to the surface, pale and glistening under the broth. She thought of Thomas, not as he was in life, broad-shouldered, laughing over a harvest mug, but as he'd become, pieces, preserved in salt and shadow, sustaining her through the lean winters. "Anew," she echoed, her laugh a dry rasp. "As if a woman like me gets second chances. You saw the journal. You know what he did before the soil claimed him." Hale set the satchel down with a soft thud, pulling out a folded cloth. Inside lay a vial of clear liquid, shimmering faintly. Laudanum. Strong enough to dull the dreams, if that's what haunts you. Or to end them, if it comes to that. His fingers trembled as he offered it, the glass catching the lantern's glow like a captured tear. She took it, turning it in her palm, feeling the cool weight. For a moment, the cellar seemed to close in, the walls pressing with the weight of unspoken accusations. Upstairs, the house groaned against the wind's remnants, a reminder that Blackthorn Manor had stood since her grandmother's time, built on land that whispered of older hungers. Eliza had fed Thomas long after the burial, yes, scraps from the table, whispers of love, but it was he who had started it, carving into the family's secrets with his greed. A distant rumble echoed from the far wall, where the root cellar adjoined the old family vault. Not thunder, but something shifting, like bones settling in their rest. Hale's head snapped toward the sound, his hand instinctively reaching for the cross that no longer hung at his neck. What was that? Eliza capped the vial and slipped it into her apron pocket. "The house talks, Reverend. Always has. But tonight, it might be company." She rose, wiping her hands on her skirts, and nodded toward the pot. "Supper's ready. Will you join me, or shall we pretend piety still has a place here?" He hesitated, eyes flicking to the shadowed corner where the vault's door stood ajar, its hinges rusted from disuse. The air grew heavier, laced with a faint, metallic tang that hadn't been there before. Hale swallowed, his resolve cracking like thin ice. "I came to help, not to partake. But if there's more to this, if the journal lied." She moved past him toward the stairs, her steps measured, leaving the pot to simmer. "Lies are for the living, Reverend. Down here, truth festers." As they ascended, the rumble came again, closer now, and in the lantern's dying light, Eliza glimpsed a flicker of movement in the vault's gloom, a hand, pale and insistent, pressing against the inner grate. Elias's fingers, cold and unyielding as the iron poker by the hearth, closed around her wrist. Widow Blackthorn froze in the dim kitchen, the lantern's flame guttering like a heartbeat on the verge of surrender. She had come down in the dead of night, drawn by the scratching again, that faint, insistent rasp from beneath the floorboards, as if roots were clawing toward the surface. But now, in the flesh or whatever passed for it, he was here, risen from the soil she'd so carefully packed over his grave 3 months past. "Martha," he rasped, his voice a dry wind through cracked earth, lips pulling back from teeth yellowed like old parchment. His eyes, once warm hazel, gleamed with a hunger that no stew could sate. She yanked her hand away, but he held fast, his grip a vice forged in the grave's chill. The air thickened with the scent of damp loam and decay, clinging to her nightgown like a shroud. She backed toward the table, where the remnants of her evening meal sat untouched, a heel of bread, a rind of cheese, offerings she'd meant for the larder, not for him. "You're not real," she whispered, though her voice trembled with the lie. The village whispers had grown louder these past weeks, the parson speaking of unrest in the churchyard, the miller's boy swearing he'd seen shadows shift under moonlight where no clouds passed. But Elias? Her Elias, buried with his Sunday best and a lock of her hair in his pocket? He couldn't be clawing back from that. His laugh was a gravelly scrape, echoing off the rafters. "Fed me well, you did. Every night, with your tears and your scraps. But it's not enough." He released her then, shuffling forward on legs that bent wrong, joints popping like splintering wood. The floorboards creaked under his weight, protesting the impossible. Martha's heart hammered, a wild bird trapped in her chest. She glanced toward the door, bolted against the autumn gale, but freedom felt as distant as the stars hidden by the storm clouds. She snatched the poker from its hook, brandishing it like a talisman. "The doctor comes tomorrow. He'll know what to do." Dr. Harrow, with his skeptical frown and tinctures that smelled of herbs and doubt, had been her reluctant confessor these past days. He'd examined the grave, pronounced it undisturbed, yet prescribed laudanum for her grief-induced visions. If only he could see this, Elias's form, pieced together from memory and madness, his skin mottled like unearthed clay. Elias tilted his head, a grotesque mimicry of affection. "He'll dig, Martha. And find nothing but bones picked clean." His hand extended, palm up, revealing nails caked with the rich, black soil of Blackthorn Hill. She remembered the nights she'd knelt by his plot, pressing food into the earth, porridge laced with her blood from a pricked finger, believing it would ease his passage. The villagers thought her pious, only she knew the truth. The pact whispered in delirium as fever took him, "Feed the dead, or they feed on you." Thunder rolled outside, shaking the window panes, and rain lashed the glass in frantic sheets. Martha's arm ached from holding the poker steady. "What do you want, then? More than the grave can hold." Her voice cracked, but she stepped forward, defiance flickering amid the dread. Elias's eyes narrowed, the hunger sharpening to something feral. "You," he said simply, and lunged. She swung the poker, the iron connecting with a sickening thud against his shoulder. It yielded like wet clay, but he didn't fall, only staggered, a low moan escaping as if she'd wounded the earth itself. Martha bolted for the stairs, her bare feet slipping on the worn treads, the lantern swinging wildly in her grasp. Shadows danced like specters, twisting the familiar hallway into a labyrinth of fear. Behind her, the scratching resumed, faster now, pursuing up the steps. She barred her bedroom door with the heavy oak chair, chest heaving as she slumped against it. The wind howled through the eaves, carrying distant cries that might have been wolves, or the villagers, roused by some unholy instinct. Elias's voice filtered through the wood, muffled but insistent, "Open, love. We've eternity to share." Dawn was hours away, but in that moment, Martha Blackthorn felt the first true fracture in her resolve. The doctor would come, yes, with his questions and his pity. But what if the grave's hunger had spread, tendrils reaching for more than one widow's devotion? She pressed her ear to the door, listening to the scratching evolve into a rhythmic pounding, and wondered if survival meant feeding the beast within, or becoming it. The lantern's flame guttered in the chill draft seeping through the Blackthorn cottage's warped floorboards, casting elongated shadows that clawed at the walls like desperate fingers. Eliza Blackthorn knelt by the hearth, her hands trembling as she portioned out the last of the salted venison, tough, gamey strips that had been her staple for weeks now, ever since the frost locked the ground and the traps came up empty. Her husband, Thomas, had always been the hunter, his broad shoulders filling the doorway with tales of the wood and the kill. Now, the cottage echoed with absence, save for the faint, rhythmic scratching from beneath the floor. She paused, knife hovering over the meat, her breath catching. The scratching had started again, softer this time, like nails on wood from the wrong side. Eliza's lips pressed into a thin line, her graying hair escaping its severe bun to frame eyes hollowed by sleepless nights. Brave in her solitude, she'd told herself, but caution gnawed at her edges now, whispering that the isolation of Widow's Hollow was no match for what lay buried in the yard. A knock shattered the quiet, 3 sharp raps on the door, insistent as a crow's call. Eliza straightened, wiping her hands on her apron stained with earth and blood. It could only be Doc Harlan, the one man she'd allowed close since Thomas's fever took him 3 months past. He was cautious by nature, his spectacles perpetually fogged from hurried breaths, but his wit had a way of piercing her defenses. "Eliza? It's me. Open up before this wind claims my hat." She unlatched the door, letting in a swirl of snow that dusted the threshold. Harlan stood there, bundled in wool, his lantern mirroring hers. Behind him loomed young Silas, the miller's boy, no more than 14, his face pale and freckled, clutching a burlap sack as if it were a shield. Silas was earnest, always trailing Harlan like a shadow, his bravery untested but flickering in his wide eyes. "Ma'am," he mumbled, avoiding her gaze, "Doc said we had to come. The river's frozen solid, and things are stirring." Harlan stepped inside, shaking snow from his boots, his voice low and measured. "The ice on the Blackthorn Creek, it's cracked in places it shouldn't. Folks in the village are whispering about lights under the water, and Silas here swears he saw your Thomas last night, walking the bank like he used to." He glanced at the boy, who nodded vigorously, though his knuckles whitened on the sack. Eliza's heart thudded, a dull ache blooming in her chest. She'd seen the lights too, faint glimmers from her window, drawing her out into the night more than once. And the feeding, God forgive her, the feeding. After the burial, when the hunger twisted her insides and the grave seemed to call, she'd unearthed just enough, portioning it out in secret, telling herself it kept his memory alive, kept the house from emptying entirely. But the scratching, it had answered her. "Don't be daft," she said, her voice steadier than she felt, turning back to the hearth. "Thomas is gone. Fever don't leave ghosts." Yet her eyes flicked to the floorboards, where the sound persisted, now joined by a low murmur, like breath through dry leaves. Silas shifted uncomfortably, the sack in his hands rustling. "But ma'am, it's not just lights. The traps by the creek, empty, but chewed through, like something hungry got there first. And this." He thrust the sack forward, untying it with fumbling fingers. Inside lay a fragment of bone, gnawed clean, etched with frost and what looked like teeth marks too human for beast. Harlan leaned in, adjusting his spectacles, his face tightening. "Found it half buried in the snow, near your fence line. Eliza, if there's something you're not saying, about the nights, the yard, we need to know. The village elders talking quarantine, saying the fever's come back unnatural." The scratching grew insistent, vibrating through the planks, and Eliza felt it in her bones, a pull, like Thomas reaching from the dark. She dropped the knife, the venison forgotten, and knelt, pressing her ear to the floor. The murmur resolved into words, faint but clear, "Feed me, love. The cold, it's endless." Silas gasped, stumbling back, while Harlan's hand went to his satchel for the Bible he always carried. "Eliza, what in God's name is that?" She rose slowly, her face a mask of resolve cracked by fear. The external chill outside was nothing compared to this, the grave's hunger spilling over, threatening to swallow the cottage whole. If they dug now, under the lantern's unsteady light, they might end it. Or feed it more. "We go to the yard," she said, snatching her shawl. "But careful, both of you. Thomas, he don't like surprises." They stepped out into the blizzard's howl, the wind whipping snow into veils that blurred the headstone silhouette. Silas carried the lantern high, its glow picking out the frozen earth, while Harlan muttered prayers under his breath. Eliza led, her steps measured, the weight of her secret pressing like an unseen hand on her shoulder. The scratching followed them, muffled but unrelenting, as if the ground itself conspired. At the grave's edge, the air thickened, a metallic tang cutting through the pine scent. Eliza knelt, her fingers tracing the frost-rimed mound. "Thomas," she whispered, not in plea but command. The earth trembled faintly, a rift cracking open like a smile, exhaling cold that fogged their breaths. Silas yelped, dropping the sack, the bone tumbling out to roll toward the fissure. Harlan grabbed his arm. "Boy, steady. We face this together, no running." From the crack, a hand emerged, pale, dirt-caked, fingers curling like roots seeking soil. Eliza's breath hitched, but she didn't recoil. Instead, she reached into her apron pocket, pulling a strip of the venison, and placed it in the grasping palm. Though the fog clung to the Blackthorn cottage like a shroud, thicker now than at any dusk Eliza could remember. She stood at the threshold, her apron twisted in her hands, the scent of damp earth and something sharper, iron, perhaps, or regret, wafting from the open door. Inside, the table was set as always, a single plate, a fork laid precisely beside it, and the covered dish steaming faintly in the chill air. But tonight, the steam carried a whisper, or so it seemed, a faint rustle like leaves underfoot in a grave. Elias's chair sat empty, its back carved with the twisting vines he'd whittled himself in healthier days. Eliza's fingers trembled as she lifted the lid, revealing the stew, chunks of meat simmered with potatoes and herbs, the broth dark and unyielding. She'd gathered the ingredients from the garden's edge, where the soil turned black and unyielding, refusing to yield vegetables anymore. The hunger had come for her too, gnawing at her ribs, but she pushed it down. Feeding him was the pact, the thread that kept the nights from swallowing her whole. A floorboard creaked behind her, and she spun, heart slamming against her stays. It was only Martha, her sister, slipping in from the back path, her shawl drawn tight against the mist. Martha's eyes, sharp as flint, darted to the table. "Still at it, then?" she murmured, her voice low, as if the walls might carry tales to the churchyard. Eliza nodded, not trusting words. Martha had come unbidden these last weeks, ever since the vicar's warnings had turned to outright accusations in the village square. "The ground remembers," Martha had said once, her hand on Eliza's arm, steadying her as they fled the jeers. Now, she crossed to the hearth, poking at the embers with a stick. "The boy's been asking questions again. Young Tommy from the mill. Saw you by the mound last night." The mound. Eliza's gaze flicked to the window, where the hill rose gentle and deceptive under the moon's pale sickle. It had been a simple grave at first, Elias's body wrapped in linen, lowered with the preacher's murmured rites. But the feeding had changed it, small offerings at first, bread crusts and milk, then meat when his voice echoed from the earth, hungry and insistent. "Wife," it had rasped one stormy eve, "feed me, or join me." She'd obeyed, telling herself it was grief's fever, but the ground had softened under her hands, yielding just enough. Martha set a bundle on the table, apples from her own orchard, bruised but whole. "Take these. Hide the rest." Her face, lined from years of scrubbing other folks' linens, softened. "He's not coming back, Eliza. Not the way you remember." But Eliza heard it then, the scratching. Faint at first, like a rat in the walls, then clearer, rhythmic, from beneath the floorboards. The cottage had settled unevenly since Elias's passing, or so she thought. Now, the sound grew, a deliberate scrape, as if nails dragged along wood from below, She froze, the ladle halfway to the plate. "Listen," she whispered, and Martha did, her poker forgotten. The scratching paused, then resumed, closer, insistent. Dust sifted from the cracks in the floor, fine as grave dirt, carrying that same iron tang. Martha's breath hitched. "It's the wind. Has to be." But her eyes betrayed her, wide and searching the shadows. She'd been the cautious one, always, urging Eliza to remarry, to leave the cursed plot. Yet here she was, night after night, drawn back by blood and pity. Eliza poured the stew onto the plate, the liquid sloshing dark. The scratching stopped abruptly, replaced by a low hum, vibrating through the boards. She set the dish down and backed away, her skirts brushing the chair legs. "Elias?" The name hung in the air, foolish and desperate. The hum swelled, and then the floor buckled. A splintering crack split the silence, wood giving way in a shower of splinters. From the hole clawed a hand, pale, dirt-streaked, fingers elongated and wrong, nails black with soil. It groped blindly, veins pulsing like roots seeking water. Martha screamed, a raw sound that cut through the fog outside. She lunged for the door, but Eliza grabbed her wrist. "No, wait." Her voice cracked, brave in its terror. The hand paused, turning palm up, as if waiting. In that moment, Eliza saw it clear, the pact unbroken, the hunger shared. She released Martha and stepped forward, spooning a morsel from the plate. The fingers twitched, and she placed it there, watching as they curled around it, pulling it down into the dark. The cottage groaned, the fog pressing closer, and outside, the mound on the hill stirred faintly, as if breathing. Martha sobbed quietly now, her hand finding Eliza's. They stood together, the night unfolding its final claim, the feeding far from over. Eleanor Blackthorn stood at the edge of the garden, the spade heavy in her blistered hands, as the first light of dawn bled across the frost-kissed earth. The air hung thick with the scent of turned soil and decay, a reminder that winter's grip had not yet fully released its hold. Her husband's mound lay quiet now, the fresh dirt undisturbed since she'd covered it the night before, whispering apologies into the wind. But the hunger in her chest twisted sharper than ever, a void that no amount of tending could fill. She'd come this far alone, driven by the old promises they'd made in the dim candlelight of their cottage, promises of devotion that bent but never broke, even in death. The neighbors had whispered, then shouted, their suspicions turning to accusations when the baker's boy went missing and the miller's wife swore she saw shadows moving where none should. Eleanor had ignored them all, her world narrowing to the patch of ground behind the hedgerow, where Thomas lay not in peace, but in waiting. Last night, the plan had unraveled. She'd lured the constable with a false tale of thieves in the night, hoping to buy time, but he'd grown wise to her deceptions. His lantern had swung too close, illuminating the faint outlines of bones she'd carefully arranged like kindling. He'd lunged, shouting for the magistrate, but Eleanor was quicker, always the one with the steady hand from years of mending nets and skinning hares. A swing of the poker, and he crumpled, his blood warm on the floorboards. She'd dragged him to the garden then, her arms burning, and begun the grim work of incorporation. Thomas would not go hungry, none of them would. Now, as the sun crested the hill, footsteps crunched on the path. Eleanor froze, the spade biting into the soil. It was Mira, the healer's daughter, the only one who'd ever shown her kindness without strings. Mira, with her sharp eyes and sharper tongue, who'd brought herbs for Eleanor's grief and stayed to listen when the nights grew long. She'd come unbidden these past weeks, sensing the rot beneath the widow's smiles, but never pressing too hard. Until now. "Eleanor," Mira called softly, her voice carrying like a warning through the mist. She emerged from the tree-lean, shawl clutched tight against the chill, a basket of bread and cheese swinging from her arm, a peace offering, or a lure. Her face was pale, etched with the exhaustion of secrets kept too long. "It's over. The village knows. They saw the constable's horse wandering loose, saddle empty. They're coming with pitchforks." Eleanor didn't turn fully, keeping her gaze on the mound. The earth there seemed to breathe, subtle shifts she'd sworn were Thomas stirring, eager for what she'd promised. "Let them come," she murmured, her voice rough from disuse. "He needs me. I need him." Mira stepped closer, her boots sinking into the soft ground. She set the basket down, as if grounding herself, and reached out a hand, not to grab, but to steady. "This isn't need, Eleanor. It's the fever in your blood, the one that took him first. I saw it in his eyes before the end, the way he clawed at nothing. You're feeding a ghost, not a man." The words struck like cold rain, but Eleanor shook them off, digging deeper. A root snagged the blade, pulling free with a wet snap that echoed too loudly in the quiet. She thought of the nights she'd unearthed him piece by piece, cooking stews from what remained, sharing them at the table as if he sat across from her still. The taste had been bitter at first, then familiar, binding them in a way the living never could. But Mira was right about the fever. It burned now, behind her eyes, making the world blur at the edges. From the village road, shouts rose, faint at first, then swelling like a storm. Torches flickered in the distance, the mob gathering momentum. Eleanor straightened, wiping mud from her cheek, and met Myra's gaze. The girl wasn't running, she stood firm, her caution giving way to something fiercer. "Help me," Eleanor said, the plea slipping out unbidden. "One last time. Cover it all, make it look like nothing happened." Mira hesitated, her fingers twisting in her shawl. Then, with a nod that carried the weight of old debts, Eleanor's aid during her own mother's passing, she picked up the second spade leaning against the fence. They worked in silence, the rhythm of earth moving steady and urgent. Scoop by scoop, they rebuilt the mound, smoothing it with calloused hands until it blended seamlessly with the garden's edge. No trace of the constable remained above ground. Below, he joined the chorus. The shouts grew nearer, boots thudding like heartbeats. Mira glanced up, sweat beading on her brow. "When they come, say I was here to help with the planting. Early spring chores." It was a thin lie, but one born of adaptation, the kind that survived in shadows. Eleanor nodded, the fever's heat ebbing just enough to let clarity seep in. Thomas was sated, for now, the soil heavy with his dew. But as the first villagers crested the hill, their faces twisted in righteous fury, she felt the cost settle deep, isolation's final thread, severed. Mira stood beside her, spade in hand, a silent ally in the unraveling. The mob halted at the garden's edge, questions tumbling out like accusations. Eleanor faced them, her voice steady, weaving half-truths about the constable's sudden illness and Myra's timely aid. Doubts lingered in their eyes, but the mound gave nothing away, and the dawn's light softened the edges of suspicion. They searched the cottage, found only empty rooms and cooling hearths, and departed with grumbles, vowing to return. As the last torch faded, Eleanor sank to her knees, the earth cool against her palms. Mira knelt too, not touching, but near. The garden whispered with the wind, a promise of growth twisted into something enduring. Thomas slept on, but the hunger in Eleanor had shifted.